I don't shake hands with low-level employees. Julian Vance didn't even look up from his scotch when he said it. He didn't know that with those 7 words, he'd just signed a $3.5 billion death warrant for his own company. I stood there, the woman who had built his empire for 10 years. He treated me like a ghost. His son Marcus looked at me like I was a broken vending machine. They thought I was the help. They thought I was a shield they could hide their crimes behind. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just the help. I was the architect. I walked out of that ballroom into the rain, but I wasn't crying. I was counting the 90 seconds it would take for the script I just uploaded to bypass their security. By tomorrow morning, Julian Vance would realize 2 things. First, I'm not a low-level employee. And second, the $3.5 billion he's celebrating is already gone. I remember the way the gold leaf on the invitation felt under my thumb. It was cold, sharp. Like everything else in that room. I was standing in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by 300 people who were laughing, drinking vintage Bollinger, and celebrating a new era for Sterling and Vance. My dress cost more than my first car. My heels were tall enough to make me look my enemies in the eye. But as I stood there, I felt like a ghost. Julian Vance, my boss, the man I had practically built this company for over the last 10 years, didn't even look at me when he took the stage. He adjusted his silk tie, flashed that $50,000 smile, and gestured toward his son, Marcus. Success, Julian's voice boomed through the speakers, is about lineage. It's about knowing who belongs at the table, and who is simply there to serve the meal. The room erupted in polite corporate laughter. I felt the air leave my lungs. I saw the way Marcus looked at me from the stage. It wasn't hatred. Hatred is a high-energy emotion. This was worse. This was indifference. He looked at me the way you look at a vending machine that's out of order, a minor inconvenience to be replaced. 10 years. I had sacrificed my 20 seconds, my holidays, and my health for this firm. I was the one who structured the $3.5 billion merger that was being celebrated tonight. I was the one who stayed up until 4 a.m. fixing the compliance errors Marcus had made because he was too busy in Mykonos to read a contract. But when I approached the VIP table to offer a final briefing on the closing documents for tomorrow, Julian didn't even stop his conversation. He held up a hand, palm toward my face, the universal sign for stop. Not now, he said, his voice flat. Julian, the transfer protocols need your signature by midnight or... He turned then. His eyes were like flint. He leaned in, just close enough for me to smell the expensive scotch on his breath. I don't discuss strategy with the help, Sarah. And I certainly don't shake hands with low-level employees on a night meant for owners. The room went quiet for me. The music was still playing, but all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. Low-level employee. I was the senior vice president of operations. I held the keys to every digital vault in the building. I looked at my hand. The hand he wouldn't shake. It was steady. Surprisingly steady. I walked out of that ballroom. I didn't take my coat. I didn't say goodbye. I walked into the rain, the cold water soaking through my silk dress, and I realized something that should have terrified me. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was empty. And in that emptiness, a very specific, very quiet plan began to form. If I had known what they were planning to do to my reputation the next morning, I would have left that day, but I stayed. Because I wanted to see the look on his face when he realized that the help was the only thing keeping his world from spinning off its axis. I used to love the sound of this office at 6 a.m. For 8 years I arrived before the sun. I thought it was a badge of honor. I thought I was essential. I remember my first year at Sterling and Vance. I was an analyst then. Julian Vance saw me staying late one Friday and stopped by my desk. He put a hand on my shoulder. A gesture that felt like fatherly encouragement back then, and told me, Sarah, people like us, we're the backbone. This company isn't just a business. It's a family. I believed him. I actually believed him. I worked through my sister's wedding. I worked through the flu. I worked through the grief when my mother passed, using the spreadsheets as a shield to keep from feeling the loss. I gave the company my life, and in exchange, they gave me a corner office and a title that sounded important. But looking back, the red flags were everywhere. I remember a meeting 3 years ago. We had just landed a massive tech account. I had designed the entire infrastructure for the deal. When the client arrived, Julian introduced everyone. "This is Marcus," he said, gesturing to his son, who had been working there for 3 weeks. "He's the visionary behind our new growth strategy." Then he looked at me. "And this is Sarah. She handles the administrative details." I felt a sting, but I brushed it off. Administrative details. I was the one who had spent 60 hours a week on that deal. But I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit, as long as the work was good. I thought loyalty was a two-way street. I remember Marcus coming into my office later that day. He threw a stack of papers on my desk. He didn't sit down. He never sat down in my office. It was as if he was afraid the low level would rub off on him. "Fix the margins on page 12, he said. "And make sure my name is on the header of every slide. My dad wants the client to know who's running the show." I looked at him, this kid who didn't know the difference between a hedge and a haircut, and I just nodded. "Of course, Marcus." I thought I was being a team player. I thought that by making them look good, I was making myself indispensable. I didn't realize I was just making myself a better target. One afternoon, I caught Julian looking at the organizational chart. He was tracing his finger over my name, then moving it down to a junior associate who happened to be Marcus's college roommate. "Sarah," he called out without looking up, "how's the $3.5 billion liquidity project coming?" "On track, Julian. We close on the 14th. "Good," he whispered. "Make sure everything is portable. I want Marcus to be able to manage the transition smoothly." I thought he meant Marcus was learning from me. I didn't realize Marcus was replacing me. Looking back, that was the first warning I ignored. The first real blow didn't happen in private. It happened in the boardroom, in front of the board of directors. We were finalizing the $3.5 billion Project Phoenix. This was my masterpiece. I had spent 18 months navigating international tax laws, hidden liabilities, and ego-driven negotiations. I stood up to give the presentation. I had my notes. I had the data. I was ready. I hadn't even reached the second slide when Marcus interrupted. "Actually, Sarah," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I think we can skip the how-to portion. The board is interested in the results, not the filing system." I paused, my hand hovering over the remote. "Marcus, the regulatory hurdles are the results. If we don't address the escrow delays, the deal won't close." Julian cleared his throat. He didn't look at me. He was looking at his watch. "He's right, Sarah. Let's keep this high level. Marcus, why don't you take over? Give us the vision." I was forced to sit down. I sat in the chair I had earned through a decade of sweat, and I watched Marcus present my slides. He even used my phrasing. He stumbled over the technical terms, but the board didn't care. They saw advance. They saw the future. After the meeting, as everyone was filing out, I approached Julian. My heart was pounding. "Julian, can we talk?" I put a lot of work into that analysis, and Marcus's summary left out the capital gains risks. Julian stopped. He didn't turn around fully. He just looked at me over his shoulder. "Sarah, you're an excellent worker. Really. But you have a tendency to make things small. You're focused on the dirt. Marcus is focused on the mountain. Don't be so sensitive. It's just business." "It's not about sensitivity," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It's about the accuracy of the $3.5 billion we're moving." He finally turned. His face was a mask of cold boredom. "Go back to your desk, Sarah. Process the wire transfers for the preliminary deposits. That's what we pay you for. Leave the leadership to us." I walked back to my office. The hallways felt longer than usual. Every person I passed seemed to know. They saw the SVP being treated like a glorified clerk. I sat at my desk and looked at the wire transfer screen. My finger hovered over the enter key. I could have stopped it. I could have raised a flag. I could have walked out right then. But I didn't. I stayed silent. I hit enter. I chose silence because I still hoped it was a mistake. I thought if I just worked harder, if I made myself even more vital, they would see. I thought it was a one-time lapse in judgment. I was wrong. It wasn't a mistake. It was a rehearsal. The morning after the board meeting, the air in the office didn't just feel different, it felt toxic. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and everyone suddenly finds the floor incredibly interesting? That was my reality at 8 a.m. I walked through the glass doors of Sterling and Vance, my heels clicking against the marble. Usually, that sound made me feel powerful. Today, it sounded like a countdown. I sat at my desk, the mahogany surface cold under my palms. I didn't open my laptop immediately. I just sat there, staring at a small framed photo of me and Julian from 5 years ago. We were standing in front of the London Stock Exchange, grinning like idiots. He had his arm around my shoulder. He told me that day that I was the daughter he never had. I looked at his smile in that photo. It didn't look like the smile of a man who would throw someone to the wolves. But then, I looked closer at his eyes. Even then, he wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at the building behind us. He was looking at the money. At 10 a.m., my intercom buzzed. It wasn't the usual Sarah, do you have a sec? It was Maya, Julian's assistant. Her voice was thin, reedy. Sarah? Julian wants to see you. In conference room 4B. Now. 4B. The icebox. It was the only room in the building without a window. It was where they handled personnel adjustments. I stood up. I didn't smooth my hair. I didn't check my makeup. I just walked. When I entered 4B, the air conditioning was cranked so low I could almost see my breath. Julian was sitting at the head of the table, flanked by Marcus. Marcus wasn't wearing a suit jacket. He had his shirt sleeves rolled up, looking like he'd just come from a workout, even though I knew he'd rolled out of bed at 9:30. He was tossing a heavy brass paperweight from hand to hand. Sit down, Sarah, Julian said. He didn't look at me. He was circling something in a red pen on a legal pad. I sat. I placed my hands on the table, interlacing my fingers to hide the fact that they wanted to twitch. We reviewed the footage from yesterday's board presentation. Julian started, his voice a low, disappointed rumble. And frankly, Sarah, the board was concerned. They felt your interruptions were unprofessional. Disruptive. I felt the first spark of heat in my chest. Interruptions? Julian, I was clarifying the escrow timelines. If those aren't met, the entire $3.5 billion deal enters a breach of contract phase. I was protecting the firm. No, Marcus chimed in, the paperweight hitting his palm with a loud smack. You were protecting your ego. You couldn't stand that I was the one holding the floor. You've developed a bit of a god complex, Sarah. You think this place can't breathe without you. I turned to Marcus. I kept my voice flat. I think this place can't breathe without accuracy, Marcus. You told the board the wire transfers were pre-cleared. They aren't. They require my secondary authorization, which is exactly the problem, Julian interrupted, finally looking up. His eyes were cold, like 2 coins. Why is a deal of this magnitude dependent on the authorization of a single employee? It's a bottleneck. It's bad management. I stared at him. It's called internal controls, Julian. It's what keeps us from being audited by the SEC. You implemented those rules yourself 8 years ago. And I'm changing them today, Julian said. The silence in the room was absolute. I could hear the hum of the server racks through the wall. I'm moving the primary authorization keys to Marcus's terminal, Julian continued, as if he were discussing a change in the office catering. It's time he took on the full responsibility of the Vance legacy. You'll spend the rest of the week transitioning your access codes to him. Julian, he doesn't have the compliance training for. He has the Vance name. Julian's voice suddenly boomed, cracking the air like a whip. He slammed his hand on the table. And that name is what this board trusts, not some functionary who has forgotten her place. Functionary. In 10 years, I had gone from family to functionary in the span of a single board meeting. This wasn't just a demotion. This was an erasure. Is this because I asked for the audit reports on the pension fund last month? I asked, the question coming out before I could stop it. Julian's eyes narrowed. Just for a second. A flicker of something fear, guilt, passed over his face before the mask of corporate stone returned. Your obsession with audits is exactly why we're making this change, Julian said softly. You've become paranoid, Sarah. You're seeing ghosts where there are only spreadsheets. It's making the staff uncomfortable. It's making me uncomfortable. He's right, Marcus added, leaning back and crossing his legs. People are talking, Sarah. They say you've been acting erratic. Maybe it's the hours. Maybe you just need a long break. This is the hallmark of the gaslight. They don't just tell you you're wrong. They tell you you're sick. They take your greatest strength, my attention to detail, My commitment to the rules, and they frame it as a mental breakdown. Am I being fired, Julian? I asked. Julian sighed, a long, weary sound, as if I were a difficult child he was trying to be patient with. Of course not. We value your history here. But for the sake of the Phoenix deal, we need you to take a back seat. Support Marcus. Be a team player. If you can do that, there's still a place for you. If not. He left the threat hanging in the freezing air. I understand, I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Someone miles away. Good, Julian said. Marcus will be by your office at 2 p.m. for the first set of keys. Don't be difficult, Sarah. It won't end well for you. I walked out of that room. My legs felt like lead. As I walked down the hallway, I passed the break room. David, the head of IT, was in there, staring at the coffee machine. He saw me and immediately looked away, his face flushing. I walked in anyway. I needed to see someone's eyes. David, I said. He didn't turn. I'm busy, Sarah. The servers are acting up. David, look at me. He finally turned. David had been my friend for years. We'd shared drinks, complained about the hours, talked about our families. But now he looked at me with a mixture of pity and something that looked a lot like shame. They're making me do it, Sarah, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. Do what? The duplicate admin profile. Marcus's. They told me to mirror your biometric signature. They said you were having some personal issues and might try to compromise the deal out of spite. I felt a coldness settle in my stomach that made 4B feel like a sauna. They told you I was going to sabotage the deal? David nodded, looking at his shoes. Julian said you'd been acting unstable since the promotion went to Marcus. He told me to keep an eye on your login activity. If you so much as look at a file you aren't assigned to, I have to report it. He looked up then, and I saw the truth. He didn't believe them, but he was terrified. He had a mortgage. He had 2 kids in private school. He wasn't going to risk his neck for the unstable woman. I'm sorry, Sarah, he said. And then he walked out, leaving his coffee behind. I stood there alone in the break room. I realized then that the escalation wasn't just about taking my job. They were isolating me. They were poisoning the well. By the time they were done, no one in this industry would ever hire me again. I would be the crazy VP who tried to burn the house down because she couldn't handle a promotion passover. I went back to my office. I locked the door, something I never did. I sat in the silence and watched the minute hand on the clock crawl toward 2 p.m. You know, there's a certain kind of peace that comes when you realize the person you'd take a bullet for is the one pulling the trigger. It clears the mind. It removes the burden of loyalty. I spent the next 3 hours doing exactly what I was told. I prepared the handover documents. I organized the files. I looked like a defeated woman preparing for her exit. But under the surface, I was listening. My office had a thin wall shared with the executive lounge, a perk Julian had given me so I could stay in the loop. I moved my chair close to the wall. I put on my noise-canceling headphones but didn't play any music. I used them as a makeshift stethoscope. At 1:45 p.m., I heard the heavy door of the lounge swing open. I heard the clink of ice in a glass. Julian and Marcus. Is she going to be a problem? Marcus's voice was muffled but clear. She's already a problem, Julian replied. But she's a predictable one. She'll hand over the keys because she still thinks there's a chance I'll forgive her. She's desperate for my approval. Always has been. Marcus laughed. It's pathetic, really. 10 years of her life, and she's handing over the $3.5 billion keys for a pat on the head. She's not just handing them over, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial silk. She's signing them. Once her digital signature is on the transfer protocols, the money moves to the Cayman accounts. And when the auditors find the hole in the pension fund next month, they'll find Sarah Bennett's fingerprints all over the theft. We'll be shocked. Of course. We'll cooperate fully with the FBI. We might even cry at her sentencing. I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just a demotion. It wasn't just gaslighting. It was a frame job. They weren't just taking my career. They were taking my freedom. They were going to use the $3.5 billion to cover the money they'd already stolen from the employees' pensions. And they were going to make me the face of the crime. What if she looks at the destination routing? Marcus asked. She won't, Julian said confidently. She's too busy trying to prove she's a team player. Besides, I've got David monitoring her. If she opens the routing subfolders, he cuts her access immediately and we fire her for security breaches before she can see a thing. I sat there, frozen. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would crack my ribs. I looked at the folder on my desk, the one I was supposed to give Marcus in 15 minutes. I realized I was standing on the edge of a cliff. They were waiting for me to take that one final step, thinking I was walking into a warm embrace. I looked at the computer screen. I looked at the authorization protocols. I had 15 minutes. I didn't try to change the routing. I didn't try to stop the transfer. If I did, David would see it. Julian would see it. And I'd be escorted out by security before I could finish. No. If they wanted my fingerprints on this deal, I would give them my fingerprints. But I would make sure those fingerprints were attached to something they never saw coming. I heard Marcus's footsteps in the hall. They were heavy, confident, the footsteps of a man who thought he had already won. I stood up and unlocked my door. I sat back down and wiped a single, genuine tear from my eye. Not out of sadness, but for the performance. Marcus walked in without knocking. He looked at me, then at the folder on my desk. You ready, Sarah? Or are we going to have another episode? I pushed the folder toward him. My hand trembled not because I was scared, but because I wanted him to see it. I wanted him to feel powerful. Here are the keys, Marcus. Everything you need for the $3.5 billion. He grabbed the folder, a triumphant smirk splitting his face. Smart move, Sarah. Maybe there's hope for you yet. He turned to leave, but he stopped at the door. He looked back at me, his eyes full of that casual, low-level cruelty. Oh, and Sarah? Don't bother coming to the closing dinner tomorrow. It's for owners only. I'm sure you understand. He walked away, laughing. I sat back in my chair. I waited until his laughter faded. Then, I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive I hadn't used in 3 years. They thought I was the victim. They thought I was the fall girl. They forgot one thing. I was the one who built the system they were trying to use. And I knew exactly where the back door was. Then I overheard something I was never meant to hear, but I had already heard enough. The war hadn't started yet. But I was the only one who knew the first shot had already been fired. I sat in my office for an hour after Marcus left. I didn't move. I didn't turn on the lights. The only glow came from my monitor, casting a ghostly blue light across my face. Owners only. The phrase felt like a brand. It wasn't just about the dinner. It was about the world they lived in versus the one they allowed me to occupy. In their world, people like me were just fuel. We were the coal you shoveled into the engine to keep the train moving until we were nothing but ash, and then we were swept away to make room for the next load. But Julian had made a mistake. A massive, arrogant mistake. He assumed that because he had stripped me of my authority, he had stripped me of my knowledge. He thought that by taking my keys he had locked me out of the house. He forgot that I was the one who had spent a decade memorizing the foundation. I looked at the clock, 6:42 p.m. The office was mostly empty. David, the IT lead who had betrayed our friendship for a mortgage, had logged off 10 minutes ago. I knew this because I had written the script that tracked executive logins, a script he didn't even know existed. I reached for my bag and pulled out the encrypted thumb drive. It was a ghost drive, something I'd put together years ago during a cybersecurity audit. It didn't mount like a normal drive. It bypassed the operating system's file explorer and communicated directly with the kernel. To David's monitoring software, it would look like a minor power surge in a USB port. I needed to see the pension fund. The Project Phoenix merger was supposed to be a $3.5 billion infusion of capital from a private equity group in Singapore. On paper, it was for global expansion. But why the secrecy? Why the need for a fall girl? I bypassed the main corporate ledger and went straight for the legacy database, the old, dusty architecture from the company's founding 30 years ago. Most of the firm's modern transactions were on the new cloud server, but the pension fund, that was still anchored to the old internal mainframe. Julian was old-fashioned. He didn't trust the cloud with his money. My fingers flew across the keys. Accessing the pension subdirectory required a triple-tier override. I used the bypass code I'd seen Julian use once during an emergency 3 years ago when the servers crashed. He'd been in a panic, his hands shaking as he typed it in. I'd memorized the rhythm of his keystrokes. Marcus's graduation year. The file opened. I felt the air leave my lungs. I actually felt a physical weight press down on my chest. The ledger was a massacre. It wasn't just skimming. It wasn't a few $1,000s here or there for a luxury car or a vacation. Since 2021, over $900 million had been diverted from the employee retirement accounts. Nearly $1 billion belonging to the janitors, the secretaries, the junior analysts, and even the senior VPs, people who had worked for Julian for 30 years, thinking their future was secure. I traced the destination of the most recent withdrawal, a $50 million chunk taken out just 3 weeks ago. It didn't go to a business investment, it went to a holding company called L&M Acquisitions. L&M, Leo, and Marcus. I dug deeper. My heart was racing now, a frantic drum in my ears. I pulled up the public registry for L&M Acquisitions. It was a shell company based out of Delaware. But the filings showed it had one primary asset, a massive, failing real estate development in Dubai, a luxury city that was currently nothing more than half-finished concrete pillars sinking into the sand. Marcus hadn't just been learning the ropes. He had been gambling with the life savings of 500 employees to save his own vanity project. And Julian hadn't just been a negligent father. He had been the one signing the checks, gutting his own company's soul to keep his son out of a debtor's prison. But the worst part, the part that made me feel physically ill, was the rebalancing plan. The $3.5 billion from Project Phoenix wasn't going to the company's growth. According to the hidden routing instructions I finally found buried in a sublayer of the merger contract, $1.2 billion was slated to be immediately lost in a bad currency trade through the Caymans. That loss would be used to fill the $900 million hole in the pension fund. It would look like a disastrous mistake made by the person in charge of the transfer. Me. I would be the one who lost the $1 billion. I would be the one who ruined the merger. And while the world was screaming at me for my incompetence or theft, the pension fund would be quietly replenished with the lost funds, and the Vances would walk away with the remaining $2.3 billion, clean as a whistle. They weren't just making me a fall girl. They were making me the savior of their crimes without me even knowing it. I leaned back in my chair. My hands were cold. I thought about Mrs. Higgins, the receptionist who had been with the firm since she was 22. She was retiring in 6 months. She talked to me about moving to the coast to be near her grandkids. I thought about David, who was so scared of losing his mortgage that he was helping the men who had already stolen his retirement. I looked at the screen. The $3.5 billion was scheduled to move at 9 a.m. tomorrow. I had 12 hours. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. A strange, icy clarity settled over me. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're driving on a frozen lake and you realize the ice is cracking, but you also realize you're the only one who knows where the shore is. I didn't change the routing. Not yet. Instead, I began to download everything. Every transfer, every signature, every email between Julian and the Dubai developers. I mapped the connection between the pension fund withdrawals and Marcus's gambling debts. I even found a series of private messages where Marcus laughed about how easy I was to manipulate. "She's so desperate for a seat at the table. She'll do the work for us and thank us for the opportunity," he'd written. I felt a ghost of a smile touch my lips. He was right. I was desperate for a seat at the table. But I didn't want their seat anymore. I wanted the whole table. I realized then that I didn't want to just stop the theft. If I stopped it now, they'd find a way to spin it. They'd fire me, erase the evidence, and try again with someone less observant. No. For justice to be real, the crime had to happen. The money had to move. The Vances needed to believe they had won. They needed to feel that moment of ultimate triumph, the moment the $3.5 billion hit their secret accounts. Because that moment of triumph was when they would be at their most vulnerable. That was when they would stop looking over their shoulders. I began to write a new script. It was a beautiful piece of code, elegant, silent, and lethal. It wouldn't stop the transfer. It would facilitate it. But it would add a few extra passengers to the data packet. It would attach a complete, uneditable forensic trail of the pension fund theft to every single dollar that moved. And the moment that money crossed the border into international waters, that trail would be automatically emailed to the SEC, the Department of Justice, and the 3 major financial news networks. But I didn't stop there. I looked at the destination account for the lost $1.2 billion. It was a shell company called Apex Horizon. I didn't change the account. I just changed the beneficiary. What I didn't know was how deep it really went. Because as I was finishing the code, a new notification popped up on Julian's private calendar, which I was still mirroring on my screen. 11:30 p.m., meeting with Chairman Chen. Chairman Chen, the lead investor for the Singapore group. The man providing the $3.5 billion. The meeting wasn't at the office, it was at a private hangar at the airport. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a corporate heist, this was an exit strategy. They weren't planning to stay and face the scandal of my arrest. They were planning to leave the country tonight, before the transfers even cleared. I wasn't just being framed, I was being left behind in a burning building while the arsonists flew to safety. I looked at the clock. 7:15 p.m. The help had 4 hours to change the ending of the story. I didn't go home. I couldn't. My apartment felt like a tomb, and I wasn't ready to be buried yet. Instead, I stayed in my darkened office, watching the shadows of the city stretch across my desk. I needed to be the first thing they saw in the morning. I needed to look like the woman they had broken, the one who was so desperate to belong that she would stay all night just to prepare. At 8:15 p.m., I heard the elevator chime. It was Julian. I could tell by the weight of his stride, heavy, rhythmic, the walk of a man who believed the ground beneath him was an extension of his will. He walked past my office, then stopped. He saw the sliver of light under my door. He knocked softly. "Sarah? You're still here." I stood up, making sure to look a little frazzled. I rubbed my eyes, letting a strand of hair fall out of my bun. I wanted him to see the loyal functionary at work. I just wanted to double-check the compliance headers for the Singapore wire. "Julian," I said, my voice intentionally thin. "I don't want Marcus to have any trouble with the clearinghouse in the morning." Julian stepped into the room. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. He stood in the blue glow of my monitors, looking at me with a warmth that, 24 hours ago, would have made me feel safe. Now, it made my skin crawl. It was the warmth of a man looking at a well-maintained tool. Sarah, he sighed, shaking his head. He walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. His palm was dry. "You really are one of a kind. After everything we discussed today, you're still looking out for us." "It's the job, Julian," I said, looking down at my desk. "It's all I have." I felt him squeeze my shoulder. "It's not just a job. You're part of the legacy. I know I was hard on you in room 4B. Marcus is. He's my son, Sarah. I have to give him room to grow, even if he stumbles. But don't think for a second I don't see what you do for this family." He leaned in closer. "I've been thinking. Once the Phoenix deal closes tomorrow and the dust settles, I want to discuss a new position for you. Chief Operating Officer. Real equity. A seat on the board." It was a beautiful lie. It was perfect. It was the carrot he'd been dangling for 10 years, and he was finally letting me smell it. He wanted me so focused on the future reward that I wouldn't notice the floor falling away beneath me in the present. "Do you mean that?" I asked, looking up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. I hated myself for how well I played the part. "I promise," he said, his voice a low, paternal purr. "Just get us through tomorrow. Handle those transfers like the pro you are. Once the money hits the accounts, your life changes forever." He wasn't lying about that last part. My life was going to change. "Thank you, Julian," I whispered. "I won't let you down." He patted my shoulder one last time and walked out. I watched him through the glass. He didn't go back to his office. He went to the executive lounge, where I heard the faint clink of glass. He was celebrating. He was drinking to the woman he had just successfully led to the slaughterhouse. 10 minutes later, I saw Marcus enter. He was dressed in a sleek, dark travel suit, not his usual corporate attire. He was carrying a slim briefcase. He didn't even look toward my office. He was humming a tune, something upbeat and vapid. I checked the mirrored display on my screen. Julian and Marcus were in the lounge now. I activated the hidden microphone I'd planted in the floral arrangement on the sideboard 3 hours ago. "The jet is ready for 11:30. Marcus's voice came through my headset. "Quiet, Marcus," Julian's voice snapped. "The walls are glass. Please." Sarah's in her office, probably crying into a spreadsheet. She's too busy being loyal to notice the world is moving without her. "Did you give her the COO speech?" "I did," Julian said. I heard the sound of liquid pouring. She swallowed it whole. She'll hit the execute button at 9 a.m. thinking she's joining the board. By the time she realizes the money went to Apex Horizon and the pension fund audit triggers her login, we'll be over the Atlantic. I almost feel bad for her, Marcus laughed. Almost. She really thought she was one of us. She actually thought the Vance name meant she could sit at the table. In this world, Marcus, there are owners and there are employees. She chose to be an employee. She chose to be a shield. It's her nature. I turned off the audio. I had heard enough. I looked at the clock. 9:45 p.m. They were going to leave the office soon to head to the hangar. They thought they were leaving behind a broken woman who would blindly follow orders until the handcuffs clicked shut. Instead, they were leaving behind a ghost in their machines. I went to work. I didn't change the destination of the $3.5 billion that would be too easy to spot. No, I did something much more surgical. I accessed the Apex Horizon destination protocols. Julian and Marcus thought Apex was their private getaway fund. What they didn't know was that Apex Horizon was a company name I had quietly registered 6 months ago during a routine tax shielding project Julian had assigned to me. I had simply never told him I'd used the name for a different shell company than the one he intended. I rewrote the beneficiary details within the encrypted layer of the wire. To the bank's interface, it would still say Apex Horizon, but the underlying account number was now linked to a trust I had established in the names of the 500 employees of Sterling and Vance. The money they were stealing to fix the pension fund would now go directly back to the people they stole it from, with a $2.6 billion bonus taken straight from the Vance's projected cut. I also added a final gift. I scheduled a delayed release email to the Singapore investors. It contained the real Dubai real estate filings, the ones showing their $3.5 billion was being used to bail out a sinking sandcastle. By the time Chairman Chen's plane landed in New York tomorrow morning, he wouldn't be looking for a partnership. He'd be looking for blood. At 10:15 p.m., Julian and Marcus walked out of the lounge. They didn't stop to say goodbye. They didn't even look toward my office. They walked to the elevator, the doors sliding shut with a soft hiss. I watched the floor indicator descend. G1. P2. I stood up and walked to the window. 5 minutes later, a black town car pulled out of the garage and sped toward the airport. I was alone in the building. I walked into Julian's office. It smelled of expensive cigars and the lingering scent of his cologne. I sat in his chair. It was incredibly comfortable. I looked at the portrait of his grandfather. Owners and employees, I whispered to the empty room. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, physical hand-stamped letter. I placed it in the center of Julian's desk. It was my resignation. Effective. Well, effective once the execute button was pressed. I didn't feel the hope Julian had tried to sell me. I felt something much better. I felt the cold, hard weight of reality. I had been the help for 10 years. I had cleaned up their messes, hidden their flaws, and built their throne. But tonight, I was the architect of their exit. That calm was the most dangerous part. Because when the world thinks you're the victim, they never see you holding the match. I walked back to my office, packed my personal things into a small box, and left the building for the last time. I didn't go to the hangar. I didn't call the police. I went to a small 24-hour diner near the airport. I ordered a coffee and a slice of cherry pie. I sat by the window and watched the planes take off into the night sky. I saw a private Gulfstream G650 climb into the clouds at 11:35 p.m. Safe travels, Julian, I said, lifting my coffee cup. Because when they landed, they wouldn't be owners anymore. They wouldn't even be fugitives. They would be broke. At 35,000 feet, the world looks small. The laws of the earth don't seem to apply when you're wrapped in the pressurized leather and mahogany of a private jet. Julian and Marcus were likely halfway across the Atlantic by now, clinking crystal glasses and looking down at the clouds, convinced they had pulled off the heist of the century. But at 12:45 a.m. I wasn't looking at the clouds. I was sitting in that diner, my laptop open on the Formica table, watching the system health monitor of Sterling and Vance. I saw it happen in real time. A notification blinked on my screen. Remote access detected. User, J. Vance, admin. Julian was awake. He was high on adrenaline and scotch, and he couldn't resist the urge to check the status of the Apex Horizon accounts. He wanted to see the digital zeros before the sun rose. I leaned in, my heart a steady, cold rhythm. I had set a mirror trap. Whatever Julian saw on his screen in the air, I saw on mine. I watched his cursor move. It was shaky, the flight turbulence, perhaps, or the excitement. He logged into the offshore portal. He entered the 16-digit encryption key I had verified for him just hours ago. But when the page loaded, it wasn't the Cayman National Bank interface. I had redirected his specific IP address to a dead-end server. It was a perfect replica of the bank site, but with one difference. Instead of a balance summary, a video file began to autoplay. It was the footage from the executive lounge. I could almost imagine the cabin of that jet going silent. I could imagine Julian's face turning a sickly shade of gray as he heard his own voice through the speakers. She'll hit the execute button, thinking she's joining the board. By the time she realizes, we'll be over the Atlantic. Then the video cut to the ledger I had found in his safe, the pension fund theft, the Dubai real estate failures, the contingency folder with my name on it. And then a text overlay appeared on his screen. It stayed there, unclosable, burning into the pixels of his $5,000 laptop. I don't shake hands with low-level employees. But I do audit them. Sarah. Then the real twist hit. While Julian was staring at the video, Marcus's phone must have started screaming with alerts. Because on my screen, I saw the secondary breach, the Singapore investors. Chairman Chen hadn't waited for morning. My delayed release email had hit his inbox while he was boarding his own private flight in London. Chen wasn't just an investor. He had ties to the kind of people you don't steal from. Within minutes, Chen had initiated a freeze and clawback order through the International Clearinghouse. But there was nothing to claw back from Sterling and Vance. Because I had already moved. The $3.5 billion hadn't just been rerouted. I had initiated a liquidated dissolution protocol, a failsafe designed for corporate bankruptcy that I'd repurposed. The money was gone. It wasn't in the Caymans. It wasn't in the firm's operating account. It had been fragmented into 500 individual, locked trust accounts for the employees. By the time the jet landed in Zurich, every secretary, every mailroom clerk, and every low-level employee would receive a notification that their pension was not only restored but tripled. But the Vances? They were now flying a $60 million jet they no longer owned toward a country that had just received an Interpol red notice for their arrest. I watched the user J. Vance admin icon turn red. Then it vanished. He had slammed the laptop shut. Or perhaps he had thrown it. I sat back and took a sip of my cold coffee. I thought about the betrayal. I thought about the 10 years of my life I had poured into their pockets. I thought about the family they promised me while they were sharpening the knife for my back. The stakes had escalated beyond money. They had tried to take my soul, my reputation, and my freedom. They wanted me to rot in a cell while they tanned on a beach. That night, I stopped crying. I didn't feel the weight of their loss. I didn't feel the sting of their words anymore. Pathetic. Functionary. Help. Those words were just sounds now. I closed my laptop. I paid for my pie. I walked out into the cool night air and looked up. High above, a tiny blinking light was moving east. They were trapped in a metal tube at 35,000 feet, realizing that the woman they underestimated hadn't just quit. She had dismantled the very sky they were flying in. And then I realized. I already had the leverage. Not just the money, but the one thing the Vances couldn't buy back. Their names were now synonymous with the biggest corporate collapse in a decade. And my name? My name was nowhere to be found. I was just a low-level employee who had disappeared in the night. I didn't go to a hotel. I didn't go back to my apartment to pack a bag. I had done that 3 days ago. Moving my essentials to a small, month-to-month rental in a part of the city where the buildings are made of brick instead of glass and steel. I sat in the dark of that new room, the only light coming from a burner phone and a single tablet. In the movies, revenge is loud. There are explosions, confrontations, and dramatic monologues. But in the corporate world, the world I had mastered, revenge is silent. It's a change in a spreadsheet. It's a missing file. It's the slow, agonizing realization that you are no longer in control of your own narrative. The Vances thought I was healing. They thought I was somewhere in a bathtub, drinking wine and mourning the career they had stolen from me. I wasn't healing. I was calculating. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-awareness. I watched the news cycles. I watched the stock tickers. I watched the social media feeds of my former colleagues. At 6 a.m., the first ripple hit. The Sterling and Vance website went dark. Then, The breaking news banners began to crawl across the bottom of the financial networks. $1 billion discrepancy found in Sterling and Vance merger. CEO Julian Vance and son Marcus Vance unreachable. I watched the reporters stand in front of the building where I had spent my youth. They looked so small against the glass tower. They were talking about financial irregularities and unconfirmed reports of fraud. They didn't know the half of it. I felt a strange detachment. For 10 years, that building had been my world. Its success was my success. Its failures were my failures. But as I watched the police tape go up across the revolving doors, I felt nothing. It was like watching a house burn down from a mile away. You can see the flames, you can see the smoke, but you don't feel the heat. They had underestimated the help because they believed their own lie that a title makes a person. They thought because I didn't have the Vance name, I didn't have the Vance power. But power isn't a name. Power is access. Power is knowing where the bodies are buried because you were the one who had to dig the graves. I checked the employee trust accounts. The liquidated dissolution had worked perfectly. While the corporate accounts were being frozen by the feds, the $3.5 billion had already been dispersed into the private protected trusts I'd set up. I saw a post on a private employee forum from Mrs. Higgins. I don't know what happened, but my retirement account just tripled. I think a miracle occurred. It wasn't a miracle, Mrs. Higgins. It was a senior VP finally doing her job. Then, the first call came to my burner phone. It was David Miller, the IT lead, the man who had spied on me for a mortgage. I let it ring. I watched the screen until it went dark. Then it rang again. And again. He was panicking. He knew that if the feds were in the building, they were looking at the server logs. He knew they would see the duplicate admin profile he had created for Marcus. He knew his security work for Julian was about to be reclassified as conspiracy to commit fraud. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. David's fear was the first dividend of my investment. I spent the afternoon scrubbing my digital footprint. I didn't need to hide I hadn't stolen anything. I had simply executed a series of pre-authorized protocols that Julian had signed himself in his arrogance. But I wanted to be a ghost. I wanted the Vances to wonder where I was. I wanted them to look over their shoulders every time a door opened. I pulled up the GPS tracker I'd embedded in the jet's flight management system. They had landed in Zurich. But they hadn't left the airport. I could see the planes sitting on the private tarmac. They were likely sitting inside, realized that their secret bank accounts were empty. Realizing that the apex horizon they had pinned their lives on was a mirror held up to their own greed. They thought I was the fall girl. They thought they were the architects. But as I looked at the flight data, I realized the final piece of the puzzle. Julian had left one secondary backup server in his vacation home in the Hamptons. It was his insurance policy, a physical drive that contained the original, unedited merger documents. If he could get to that drive, he might be able to frame the Singapore investors for the loss and claw back some of the reputation he'd lost. He thought I didn't know about the Hamptons server. He thought he was the only one with the key. And then I realized, I already had the leverage. I didn't need to go to the Hamptons. I had remotely cloned that server 3 months ago during a routine maintenance check Julian had been too busy to supervise. I held their entire lives in the palm of my hand. Every secret, every bribe, every lie they had told for 30 years. I leaned back and looked at the ceiling. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for instructions. I wasn't waiting for a, "Good job, Sarah." I wasn't waiting for a seat at the table. I was the one who decided when the lights went out. And all I had to do was wait. I didn't reach out to them. I didn't have to. In the high-stakes world of billionaire flight, silence is the loudest sound you can make. By now, sitting on that tarmac in Zurich, Julian and Marcus were living in a vacuum. Their credit cards would be flagging. Their fixers would be stopped at the border. Their world was shrinking to the size of a Gulf Stream cabin. At 3 p.m., I decided it was time to show them exactly how short their leash was. I didn't use a phone. I used the jet's own internal communication system, the air text screen built into the armrests of their leather seats. I sent a single file to the cabin. It wasn't a message. It was a PDF. It was the master manifest of the Hamptons backup server, the one Julian thought was his lifeboat. I included the file paths for the last 10 years of his personal tax returns, the offshore wire transfers to the Dubai contractors, and, most importantly, the digital recordings of the executive lounge conversations I'd captured the night before. I watched the message read receipt blink on my tablet. I could almost see Marcus jumping out of his seat, shouting at the pilot to do something. I could see Julian, his hands finally shaking, staring at the screen as he realized his insurance policy had been cashed by the beneficiary he tried to kill. This was the leverage. It wasn't just money. It was the total, absolute destruction of their legacy. You see, men like Julian Vance don't fear prison as much as they fear being unimportant. They fear the world knowing they weren't geniuses, that they were just common thieves who got lucky until a low-level employee decided to stop helping them hide. I sent a second message. This one was text. The Singapore group has the Dubai filings. The SEC has the pension ledger. The Swiss authorities have your tail number. You have 45 minutes of fuel left on that auxiliary power unit before the cabin goes dark. What is the Vance name worth now, Julian? The reply came back 2 minutes later. It was from Marcus. It was typed in all caps, riddled with typos. You're dead, Bennett. I'll spend every cent to bury you. We have lawyers you can't even imagine. You stole our money. That's federal. We'll have you in a cell by Monday. I smiled. It was the first time I had felt true, genuine amusement in years. He still didn't get it. He was still trying to use the old rules. He thought he was playing a game of who can hire the most expensive shark. He didn't realize the ocean had been drained. I typed back, my fingers steady and slow. You have no sense, Marcus. I didn't steal your money. I returned the employee's money. As for your secret accounts, those don't exist. Check the beneficiary name on the Apex Horizon wire one more time. It's not Vance. It's the Sterling and Vance Victim Trust. You signed it yourself. I watched the user typing icon flicker on and off for 5 minutes, then it stopped. The silence from the other side was the sound of a man drowning. I had the leverage to keep them in Zurich forever. I had the leverage to send them to a federal penitentiary for the rest of their natural lives. But I wasn't done. I looked at the third folder on my tablet. It was the one I hadn't shared with the authorities yet. It was the black book of Julian's political connections, the senators, the judges, and the regulators who had taken consulting fees to look the other way for a decade. If I released that, the entire industry would collapse. Thousands of people would lose their jobs. The collateral damage would be massive. Julian knew I had it. He knew that this was the one card I held that could burn the world down, and he was terrified I was emotional enough to play it. They thought I was an emotional girl who wanted revenge. They didn't realize I was a strategist who wanted a clean slate. I sent a final message for the day. I'm going to sleep now. When I wake up, the sun will rise in Zurich. You have until then to decide if you want to be the men who went down for fraud, or the men who went down for treason. The choice is yours. But remember, Julian, I'm the only one who knows the difference anymore. I closed the tablet. I walked over to the window of my small room. The city was quiet, the low-level world was sleeping, getting ready to wake up and work for their dreams. For the first time in 10 years, I felt like I was one of them. I didn't have a $3.5 billion merger. I didn't have a corner office. I didn't have the Vance name. I just had the truth. And in this moment, the truth was the only currency that mattered. All I had to do was wait. There is a specific kind of madness that sets in when powerful men realize the walls are no longer moving for them. In the cabin of that Gulf Stream, the oxygen hadn't changed, but the air was disappearing. I sat in my quiet apartment, 3,000 miles away, watching the data stream. I wasn't just watching their bank accounts. I was watching the internal diagnostics of the plane. I could see the cabin lights being dimmed to save power. I could see the satellite phone attempts, 32 failed calls to high-priced defense attorneys in New York and London. All of them were being blocked. Not by me, but by the morality clause triggers in their own corporate contracts. The second the news of the pension theft broke, their legal retainers were automatically suspended. At 4 a.m. Zurich time, the first domino fell. It wasn't a legal move. It was an emotional one. I activated the cabin's security audio feed. The sounds were distorted by the hum of the auxiliary power unit, but the voices were unmistakable. You told me it was handled. Marcus's voice was a ragged scream. I heard the sound of a glass shattering against the bulkhead. You said Bennett was too stupid to see the routing. You said she lived for your approval. Shut up, Marcus. Julian's voice was a low, dangerous hiss. It was the voice he used when he was truly cornered. I spent 30 years building a fortress and you turned it into a target. If you hadn't lost those millions in Macau, we wouldn't have had to touch the pension fund in the first place. Oh, don't you dare, Marcus spat. You loved the Dubai deal. You wanted that Vance Tower as much as I did. You signed every single wire, Dad. Don't act like you were just protecting me. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 30 years of lies. This was the first consequence, the death of their loyalty. Their relationship wasn't built on love, it was built on shared spoils. And once there were no spoils left, there was only blame. I watched the user activity on Julian's tablet. He was trying to access a hidden offshore account in the Cook Islands, a small emergency fund of about $5 million that I had intentionally left visible. It was the bait. He moved his cursor to the transfer button. He was going to try to bribe the Swiss ground crew to let them off the plane and into a private car before the federal agents arrived. I let him enter the password. I let him select the amount. And then, I triggered the account conflict error. To Julian, it looked like Marcus had already tried to move the money. I watched through the cabin camera. Julian slowly turned his head toward his son, who was slumped in a leather chair with his head in his hands. Did you try to drain the Cook Islands account? Julian asked. His voice was terrifyingly calm. Marcus looked up, confused. What? No. I haven't even touched my laptop. Liar, Julian whispered. He stood up, his face flushed a dark, bruised purple. You're already planning to sell me out, aren't you? You think if you pin the pension theft on the old man, the feds will give you a deal. I didn't touch the money, Dad. You've been stealing from me since you were 12, Marcus. Why would today be any different? I watched as the two men who had once looked down on the world from the heights of Manhattan began to grapple in the narrow aisle of a jet. It wasn't a cinematic fight. It was desperate, clumsy, and pathetic. They weren't owners anymore. They were two rats in a gilded cage, realizing the cheese was gone and the floor was electrified. I felt a cold satisfaction. For years, I had been the one to smooth over their arguments. I was the one who mediated their egos so the company could function. I was the glue they bragged about. Well, the glue was gone, and without it, the Vance legacy was just a pile of broken glass. At 5:15 a.m., the local Swiss police arrived on the tarmac. Not to arrest them, not yet. They were there to serve an asset seizure notice on the plane itself. The stairs lowered. The cold morning air of Zurich rushed into the cabin. I watched through the exterior airport feed as Julian and Marcus were led down the steps. They weren't in handcuffs, but they looked like ghosts. Their suits were wrinkled. Their hair was a mess. They looked every bit the low-level criminals they had always been under the surface. As Julian reached the bottom step, he looked directly at the security camera. He knew I was watching. I reached out and clicked a button on my tablet. A final notification popped up on Julian's smartwatch, which was still synced to the office network. I leaned back and closed my eyes. I could hear the city waking up outside my window. People were walking to the subway, starting their shifts, living their lives. The Vances were being led into a windowless room in the Zurich terminal. They thought they could buy their way out. They thought they could blame each other. But they didn't realize that I had already sent the Cook Islands logs to the authorities. By the time they finished their first interview, they would both be charged with attempted money laundering in addition to the fraud. They blamed the wrong person. And that was the only mistake I needed them to make. The holding cell in the Zurich airport terminal was never designed for men who buy their suits on Savile Row. It was a room of white tile, flickering fluorescent lights, and the faint, persistent smell of industrial bleach. I watched through a redirected feed from the local precinct's internal network. Julian Vance was sitting on a plastic bench, his head in his hands. Marcus was pacing the 3-pace width of the cell, kicking the baseboard every time he turned. Where are they? Marcus's voice was a jagged edge. I've called the New York office 6 times. Why isn't the firm's legal team on the phone with the consulate? Julian didn't look up. Because there is no New York office anymore, Marcus. The feds moved in at 9 a.m. Eastern. They've locked the doors. The partners are all hiring their own counsel. Nobody is coming to save the Vance name because that name is now a liability. I watched Julian reach into his pocket and pull out his phone. It was almost dead. He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the contacts. He looked like a man trying to find a life jacket in a shipwreck, only to realize he's already underwater. At 7:15 a.m., My personal phone, the one they had known for a decade, vibrated on my bedside table. I didn't answer. I just watched it dance across the wood. Caller ID. Julian Vance. He waited 30 seconds, then called again, then a third time. Finally, a text message arrived. Sarah. Please. We need to talk. There has been a massive misunderstanding with the Singapore funds. I know you're upset about the board meeting, but we can fix this. I'll give you whatever you want. Just tell the clearinghouse to release the Apex hold. I felt a surge of cold, clinical interest. He was still trying to fix it. He was still bargaining with a hand that contained nothing but air. I waited 10 minutes. I wanted him to feel the weight of the silence. I wanted him to wonder if I had already turned my phone off and disappeared forever. Then, I answered, "Hello, Julian." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Sarah. Thank God. Listen, it's a mess over here. The Swiss authorities are overreacting. They think the $3.5 billion was diverted illegally. I told them you were the only one who had the final authorization keys. You need to call the Zurich precinct and explain that it was a technical error. A technical error, Julian? I asked. My voice was like ice, smooth and dangerously thin. Was the pension fund theft a technical error? Were the Dubai kickbacks an error? Or was the contingency plan to send me to prison a glitch in the system? The silence from his end lasted for a full 10 seconds. I could hear Marcus in the background, shouting, "Is that her? Give me the phone." Sarah, look, Julian's voice was different now. The corporate velvet was gone. It was replaced by a raw, desperate tremor. I'm an old man. Marcus is. He's just a boy. He doesn't know what he's doing. If we go down for this, 500 people lose their livelihoods. The company dies. Is that what you want? To be the one who killed Sterling and Vance? I didn't kill it, Julian. I just stopped being the one to keep it on life support. Please, he whispered. The word sounded foreign coming from him. Tell me what you want. Money? I have private holdings in Panama. They aren't on the books. 20 million. 50 million. It's yours. Just help us clear the fraud charges. Tell them the transfer to Apex was your mistake. I'll make sure you never have to work again. I looked at my reflection in the window. I didn't look like a woman who wanted $50 million. I looked like a woman who had finally found the truth. You're still trying to buy me, Julian. Even now, in a cell, you think I'm a low-level problem that can be solved with a check. But you've forgotten one thing. What? I already have the money. The employees have the money. And I have the recordings of you and Marcus in the lounge, planning to frame me while you drank 40-year-old scotch. I heard the sound of the phone hitting the floor on his end. Then the sound of Marcus screaming, a wordless animal sound of pure panic. They weren't just unraveling. They were shattering. They came to me for help because they had spent their entire lives believing that everyone has a price. They couldn't conceive of a person who simply wanted them to face the consequences of their own actions. Sarah. Julian's voice was back, but it was frantic now. Sarah, don't hang up. What are you going to do? I'm going to do exactly what you taught me, Julian, I said. I'm going to protect the interests of the shareholders. And right now, the shareholders want justice. I hung up. I watched the feed. Julian was slumped against the white tile wall. Marcus was sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth. They had reached the stage of total antagonist panic. The stage where the reality of their situation finally breached the hull of their arrogance. They weren't owners anymore. They were just two men waiting for the door to open and the handcuffs to click. And for the first time in 10 years, I felt emotionally neutral. I didn't hate them. I didn't pity them. I just watched them. The air in my small rental was still. Outside, the world was waking up to the largest corporate scandal in recent memory, but inside this room, it was a laboratory. I sat at my desk, the glow of 3 different monitors reflecting in my glasses. I hadn't slept more than 2 hours, but I wasn't tired. I felt a strange, crystalline focus, the kind of clarity you only get when you're finishing a marathon. Extradition is a slow process, but for Julian and Marcus Vance, the wheels were turning with terrifying speed. Because the Singapore group I'd alerted wasn't just a group of investors, they were a sovereign wealth fund with a very short temper. By 10 a.m., the Swiss authorities had already processed the paperwork. The Vances weren't going to spend weeks in a Zurich jail. They were being put on a federal transport plane back to New York within the hour. They thought they still had a chance to spin the narrative once they hit U.S. soil. They thought they could use their connections to bury the evidence. But they didn't know I was currently building the vault. I opened a secure encrypted cloud partition. I labeled it Exhibit A, the Vance Legacy. Inside, I began to arrange the final setup. I didn't just dump files, I curated them. I built a chronological map of their downfall, designed so that even the most junior federal prosecutor could understand it in 5 minutes. Folder 1, the pension ledger. I highlighted the $900 million in withdrawals, cross-referencing them with Marcus's personal gambling losses and the Dubai construction invoices. Folder 2, the contingency documents. I placed the forged emails Julian had created to frame me right next to the original server logs that proved they were created from his personal IP address at 2 a.m. on a Sunday. Folder 3, the audio. I cleaned up the lounge, recording the one where Julian called me the help and Marcus laughed about me swallowing the COO speech. That was the most important piece, not because it was illegal but because it destroyed their humanity. It showed the jury and the world exactly who they were when they thought no one was listening. I looked at the execute button on the data transfer. Once I hit this, there would be no going back, no settlement, no quiet resignation. It would be a total, public collapse. I thought about Julian's face in the Zurich cell. I thought about the way he'd begged me for help, still trying to use his stolen millions to buy my soul. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the gold leaf invitation I'd kept from the ballroom gala. The one Julian wouldn't shake my hand at. I looked at the embossed Vance crest. It looked so important. So permanent. I took a lighter from the desk and held the flame to the corner of the card. I watched the gold curl and blacken. I watched the Vance name disappear into ash in a small glass tray. I turned back to the screen. I had set the final conditions. I had ensured the employees were paid. I had ensured the evidence was unshakable. The stakes were no longer about my career, they were about the 500 people whose futures had been used as chips in a game they didn't know they were playing. I checked the flight tracker. The federal transport plane was over the Atlantic. Julian and Marcus were likely sitting in the back of that plane, handcuffed to their seats, realizing that the low-level employee they had mocked was currently the only person in the world who knew their true value. They thought they were winning because they had the name, the money, and the power. They didn't realize those things are only as strong as the people who maintain them. And the help had just walked off the job. I moved my cursor over the Send to Department of Justice button. I took a deep breath. My finger was steady. For the help, I whispered. The progress bar moved across the screen. 10%, 50%, 100%. Upload complete. Recipients notified. I leaned back and let out a long, slow breath. The room felt lighter. The air felt cleaner. The final conditions were set. The trap was locked. All that was left was for the plane to land and the curtain to rise on the final act. They thought they were the stars of the show. They didn't realize they were just the villains in mine. Teterboro Airport at 6 p.m. is usually a place of quiet, expensive arrivals. It's where the elite slip into black SUVs and vanish into the Manhattan skyline without a word. But today, the tarmac was flooded with a different kind of light. I watched the live feed from a news helicopter circling overhead. The blue and red strobes of federal vehicles turned the pavement into a flickering kaleidoscope. The federal transport plane taxied to a halt in a remote corner of the airfield. The engines whined down, a long, mournful sigh that echoed the end of an era. For 10 years, I had been the one to arrange these flights. I had been the one to ensure the car was waiting, the scotch was poured, and the path was cleared. This time, I had arranged a different kind of reception. The door of the plane opened. The wind caught Julian's hair as he stepped out first. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His white shirt was rumpled, open at the collar. He looked smaller than I remembered. Without the mahogany desk and the $3.5 billion shield, he was just a 70-year-old man with tired eyes and a stoop in his shoulders. Then came Marcus. Marcus tried to play the part until the very end. He kept his head up, scanning the crowd of agents and cameras as if he were looking for a fan club. He still had that smirk, the one that said he was too important for consequences. But when the first agent reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder to guide him toward the van, I saw the smirk vanish. I saw his knees buckle, just for a second. They were led down the stairs in silence. No shouting. No grandstanding. The media was kept behind a perimeter, but the long lens cameras caught everything. I sat in my darkened room, my face illuminated by the screen, watching the Vance name be systematically dismantled in front of the world. The lead agent stopped Julian before he entered the vehicle. He handed him a thick packet of papers. I knew exactly what was in that packet. It was the vault I had uploaded an hour ago. Julian looked at the first page. Even from a distance, through a grainy zoom lens, I saw the moment the blood left his face. He wasn't looking at an indictment, he was looking at his own words. He was looking at the digital signatures he thought were buried in a Swiss server. He looked up at the camera at me. He didn't know where I was, but he knew I was watching. He knew that every step he took from that plane to the jail cell had been choreographed by the woman he didn't think was worth a handshake. The vehicles pulled away. The public collapse was over in 12 minutes, but the ripples were just beginning. I switched the channel to the financial news. Sterling and Vance Board of Directors issues statement. Firm to enter immediate receivership. All assets frozen. The ticker at the bottom of the screen was a graveyard of numbers. The stock had hit zero. The Vance Tower was being stripped of its name by the end of the week. But then, the news anchor's voice changed. In a shocking turn of events, it appears the $3.5 billion Singapore merger funds were not stolen but instead rerouted into a protected trust for the firm's 500 employees. Sources say the pension fund, which had been gutted by the Vances, is now fully restored. I leaned back in my chair. I thought about the ballroom. I thought about the way the champagne bubbles looked in the light before the betrayal. I thought about the person I was when I believed that loyalty was a debt I owed to my superiors. I wasn't that person anymore. I stayed controlled. I didn't cheer. I didn't pour a drink. I didn't call the news to take credit. Revenge is a meal best served in a vacuum. If I came forward, the story would be about the disgruntled employee. By staying silent, the story remained about the corrupt Vances. I didn't want the fame. I wanted the vacuum to swallow them whole. The truth had been revealed decisively. The antagonists had been exposed. And as the last police cruiser left the Teterboro tarmac, the world finally knew what I had known all along. The Vances weren't the architects of the company. They were the parasites. And the host had finally shaken them off. But that wasn't the end. Because while the world was looking at the handcuffs, they weren't looking at the small, offshore account I'd set up in my own name, one that contained exactly $1. A symbolic dollar. The only dollar I had ever taken that didn't come from a Vance paycheck. The first dollar of my new life. 2 weeks later, the world had moved on to a new scandal, a new crisis. That's the nature of the city, it consumes its own history at a voracious pace. But for me, the world had slowed down to a rhythmic, peaceful crawl. I was sitting in a small quiet cafe in a town I won't name. It was 300 miles away from the glass towers and the predatory hum of Manhattan. I had a book I actually wanted to read, a coffee that didn't taste like a deadline, and a window that looked out onto a street where no one knew my name. I opened my laptop one final time to check the fallout. It was no longer about survival. It was about closure. The headlines were clinical now. Vance prosecution enters discovery phase. Prosecutors cite overwhelming digital evidence. Julian and Marcus were being held without bail. The flight risk was too high, partly because of the jet, and partly because they had no home to return to. Their penthouse had been seized. Their cars were at auction. Even the portrait of the grandfather I had moved to open the safe was sitting in a federal evidence locker. But it was the social fallout that interested me more. I saw an interview with Mrs. Higgins. She was standing in front of a small cottage, looking radiant. She told the reporter she had been able to retire early after all. She didn't know who Sarah Bennett really was. She only knew me as the girl who always looked tired, but she told the camera, "Whoever fixed that ledger, they saved my life." Then there was David Miller. I saw his name in a small sidebar on a legal blog. He hadn't been charged with fraud, but he had been barred from working in financial IT for 5 years. He'd taken a plea deal to testify against Julian. He was working at a local repair shop now. I felt a brief flicker of something, not quite pity, but a recognition of the cost of fear. David wasn't a bad man. He was just a man who thought he was too small to be honest. The consequences were rippling outward, touching everyone who had looked the other way while the Vances built their empire of sand. The board of directors had been dissolved. The Singapore group had recouped their losses through the insurance bonds I'd triggered. The system had corrected itself. Not because the system is good, but because I had used its own weight to crush the people who tried to break it. I looked at my own bank account. I hadn't taken the millions Julian offered me. I hadn't touched the employee trust. I had only my own savings, 10 years of low-level wages I'd lived on while working 80-hour weeks. It wasn't a fortune, but it was mine. It was clean. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It took me a moment to recognize it because it had been absent for so long. It was lightness. For a decade, I had carried the weight of the Vance legacy. I had carried their secrets, their egos, their failures, and their laundry. I had walked with my shoulders hunched, waiting for the next crisis, the next insult, the next "not now, Sarah." Now, my shoulders were level. My breath was deep. I saw a final photo of Julian in the digital tabloid. He was being led into a courthouse. He was wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The Vance name didn't protect him from the fluorescent lights. He looked like exactly what he had called me, a functionary. A man caught in the gears of a machine he no longer understood. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel the need to gloat. I just felt finished. Revenge is a heavy thing to carry. It's a fire that keeps you warm while you're in the cold, but eventually, you have to put it out if you want to walk into the light. I closed the laptop. I didn't just close the lid. I shut down the operating system. I took the burner phone and the encrypted drives and walked to the edge of the pier. One by one, I watched them sink into the dark water. For the first time, I felt light. It took me 3 months to stop waking up at 4:30 a.m. with my heart racing, reaching for a phone that wasn't there. For 10 years, my nervous system had been tuned to the frequency of Julian Vance's whims. I was an instrument played by someone else's hands, and even after the hands were gone, the strings still vibrated with the tension. But slowly, the silence of my new life began to fill with something else. I bought a small house in a town where the tallest building is a grain silo. The air here doesn't smell like ozone and exhaust. It smells like pine and damp earth. I spend my mornings on the porch, watching the fog lift off the fields. In the beginning, I didn't know what to do with myself. I had spent my entire adult life being the senior VP, the architect, the fixer. Without a title, I felt like a ghost. I'd go to the grocery store and feel the urge to check the stock prices of the cereal I was buying. I'd see a delivery truck and start calculating the logistical efficiency of its route in my head. I was a Ferrari parked in a garden. But then, I started to set new boundaries. Not with others, I didn't know anyone here yet, but with myself. I made a rule. No screens before 9 a.m. I started a garden. Not because I was good at it, but because the plants didn't care about my security clearances. They didn't ask me to frame a competitor. They just needed water and time. I found a local nonprofit that helps small business owners with their accounting, people who have a dream but are drowning in the paperwork. I remember the first woman I helped. Her name was Elena. She ran a small bakery and was about to lose her lease because of a predatory clause she didn't understand. I sat with her for 2 hours. I didn't use a terminal or an encrypted bypass. I used a pencil and a legal pad. When I showed her how to restructure her debt, she started to cry. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Thank you, Sarah," she said. "I don't know why someone like you is helping someone like me." I looked at our joined hands. For the first time in my life, a handshake didn't feel like a transaction. It felt like a connection. "I'm just a low-level employee, Elena," I said. And for the first time, I meant it as a point of pride. I've reclaimed my name. Not the one on the Vance and sterling letterhead, but the one my mother gave me. Sarah. Just Sarah. I don't look at the news anymore. I don't need to see the Vance trial updates to know how the story ends. The Vances are in a world of gray walls and iron bars, a world where their names have no currency. They are living the life they designed for me. And I am living the life they thought I wasn't worthy of. I spent years trying to get a seat at a table that was built on theft and vanity. I thought the view from the top of the tower was the only thing that mattered. But as I sit here on my porch, watching the sun dip below the trees, I realize that the tower was a cage. I have a new routine now. I walk to the library. I talk to my neighbors. I sleep 8 hours a night. I don't wait for permission to exist. If I could speak to my old self, the girl who stayed up until 4 a.m. fixing Marcus's mistakes, the girl who swallowed insults like they were medicine, I tell her that your value isn't something someone gives you in a performance review. It's something you carry with you when you walk out the door. That strength I used to build their empire? It's mine now. And I'm finally using it to build something that won't turn to ash when the lights go out. The final audit of my life didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in the quiet of my own heart. People often ask, or they would, if they knew the truth, why I didn't take more. Why I didn't skim a few million for myself during the dissolution. Why I didn't become the very thing I was fighting. The answer is simple, because then they would have won. If I had taken the money, I would still be tied to them. I would be a different version of Marcus. I would be looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next Sarah to come along and find the hole I left behind. The greatest revenge isn't taking what someone has. It's showing them that what they have has no power over you. The Vances are gone. The company is a case study in business schools. The building has a new name on the glass. The world has moved on, and so have I. But I learned a universal lesson in those 10 years of silence. We are often told that the world belongs to the loud, the aggressive, and the powerful. We are told that the help is invisible, that loyalty is a weakness to be exploited. But the world actually runs on the people who do the work, the people who see the details, the people who hold the keys because they are the only ones who know how to turn the locks. If you are in a place where you are being diminished, where your hand is being pushed away, and your voice is being silenced, remember this. The people at the top are only there because you are holding the ladder. And you have the right to let go. I'm standing in my garden now. The sun is almost gone, the air is cool. I look at my hands. They are steady. They are clean. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found a bit of your own strength in these words, I'd love for you to share this journey with someone else who might be feeling invisible today. Sometimes, all it takes to change the world is for one low-level person to realize they are the most powerful person in the room. Don't also forget to like, comment and subscribe to this channel.